acts of fundamental injustice and discrimination, seeking forgiveness and committing to the rectification of past policies and misdeeds. Whereas between 1849 and 1853, about 24,000 young Chinese men immigrated to California. And by 1870, there were an estimated 63,000 Chinese Americans in the United States, 77% of whom resided in California. Whereas Chinese immigrants were the primary workforce in developing Santa Clara County, as the fruit bowl of America, and San Jose was home to 5 Chinatowns, including the first Market Street Chinatown from 1866 to 1870, the Vine Street Chinatown until 1872, Second Market Street Chinatown, the one that was located here from 1872 to 1887, the Woolen Mills Chinatown, 1887 and 1902, and Heinleinville, lasting from 1887 to 1931. And whereas San Jose was a center of agriculture and Chinese immigrants were critical to the economy, industry, and progress of Santa Clara County, including in the manufacturing and heavy construction, notably as workers on the San Jose Railroad and the Santa Cruz Monterey line in the 1870s. And whereas Chinese immigrants were met with virulent racism and xenophobia, and the violence of anti-Chinese forces in San Jose from early on denied equal protection before the law. And whereas in 1869, the First Methodist Episcopal Church on 2nd and Santa Clara Streets, which taught Sunday school to Chinese immigrants, was burned to the ground. And the minister, Thomas Dunn, received death threats. And whereas after passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which denied naturalization to U.S. citizenship and restricted Chinese immigration, anti-Chinese acts became institutionalized and empowered by federal, state, and local acts. And anti-Chinese conventions were held in San Jose, including the first state convention of the Anti-Chinese League in 1886. And whereas the policies, resolutions, and other actions of the City of San Jose and City Council directly contributed to the xenophobic discrimination and racial violence faced by Chinese immigrants, and whereas the City Council condemned all Chinese laundries on the basis they operated in wooden buildings after denying 14 Chinese laundry operators who filed a petition on January 14, 1886, requesting to continue their laundry businesses. And Mayor G.T. Settle broke the tie vote, and the motion before San Jose City Council to condemn the Chinese laundries was carried. And whereas the city made plans to remove San Jose's Market Street Chinatown for the building of the new City Hall downtown. And on March 25th, 1887, an order declaring the Chinatown at Market and San Fernando Streets a public nuisance was unanimously approved by Mayor C.W. Brayfogle and the entire City Council. And whereas the Market Street Chinatown succumbed to arson on May 4th, 1887, before official action could be taken, leading to the destruction of homes and businesses and the displacement of 1,400 members of the San Jose Chinese community. Whereas on June 2nd, 1887, after burning of the Market Street Chinatown, when John Heinlein requested permits for building a new Chinatown on his property, his request was declared out of order by the mayor. And whereas on June 8, 1887, at a mass rally of citizens gathered on the corner of 5th and Jackson Street to protest the building of a new Chinatown, a resolution drafted by Mayor Brayfogle and the entire City Council was read to a crowd stating that a Chinatown is a, quote, public nuisance, injurious to private property adjacent thereto, dangerous to the health and welfare of all citizens who live and have homes in its vicinity, and a standing menace to both public and private morals, peace, quiet, and good order, unquote. And whereas on July 25th, 1887, the City Council voted to allow only materials made by white labor in the construction of the new City Hall. Whereas in 1888, despite vehement opposition from the city and its citizenry, John Heinlein finished construction of the new Chinatown, which would be known as Heinleinville, and would last for 44 years until 1931. And whereas in 1949, the city voted to demolish the historic Yingxing Temple, the building, and to take over the property despite attempts by the Chinese community to save the temple as a historic landmark. And whereas the city stored the historic Yingxing altar under the municipal stadium, where it suffered damage from outdoor exposure for the next 40 years, until the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project was asked to work with the city on collection and maintenance of artifacts found in the building of the Fairmont Hotel in 1987. And whereas the Chinese exclusion laws were repealed in 1943 and subsequent federal legislation officially banned racial bias in immigration and citizenship, a fundamental step in the struggle for racial equality and justice in the United States. Whereas the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project built a replica of the historic temple building, installed exhibits of Chinese American history of the Santa Clara Valley, and gifted the museum to the city as a token of friendship and forgiveness from the Chinese American community in 1991. And whereas the recent rise in anti-Asian violence and racial discrimination demonstrates that xenophobia remains deeply rooted in our society, and whereas Asian Americans are still considered perpetual foreigners, and whereas the story of Chinese immigrants and the dehumanizing atrocities committed against them in the 19th and early 20th century should not be purged from or minimized in the telling of San Jose's history. And whereas the city must acknowledge and take responsibility for the legacy of discrimination against early Chinese immigrants as part of our collective consciousness that helps to contribute to the current surge in the anti-Asian and Pacific Islander hate. And whereas a genuine apology for the role of the city in this history and legacy is an important and necessary step in the process of racial reconciliation, and whereas an apology for grievous injustices cannot erase the past, but admission of historic wrongdoings committed can aid us in solving the critical problems of racial discrimination facing America today. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Council of the City of San Jose apologizes to all Chinese immigrants and their descendants who came to San Jose and were victims of systemic and institutional racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. The Council acknowledges the acts of fundamental injustice, terror, cruelty, and brutality, including the dismantling and destruction of the city's Chinatowns. It recognizes the contributions and resilience of the Chinese community and their commitment to fostering reconciliation and friendship. And we resolve to rectify the lingering consequences of the discriminatory policies of the city of San Jose, and to use this resolution as a teaching moment for the public to move forward toward justice for all. adopted this 28th day of September 2021 by the following vote. Ayes, Mayor Sam Liccardo, Vice Mayor Chappie Jones, Councilmember Sergio Jimenez, Councilmember Raul Perales, Councilmember David Cohen, Councilmember Magdalena Carrasco, Councilmember Deborah Deb Davis, Councilmember Maya Esparza, Councilmember Sylvia Arenas, Councilmember Pam Foley, and Councilmember Matthew Mahan.